Kelly, something that you had identified in our show that I had never realized was this idea that when we switched over from pensions and Social Security being the thing that's going to take you home in the twilight of your years to this 401k kind of system, something seemed to kind of like disconnect. And now all of a sudden we weren't taking the incremental steps that we needed on our own, even though we were given these different options. Is that, I mean, am I representing that correctly? Yeah.
Yeah. We kind of went from pensions to retirement plans like 401ks are pretty commonly thought of. And the responsibility went from your company saving for you to give you a specific monthly income for the rest of your life to maybe helping you save, but it was the responsibility fell to you to save and make sure that you had enough investments, funds that would produce income that would replace your income over time. And I think what's happened is I just see sort of a lack of education and access. So in my practice, people are coming to me, they're working hard, they're making good money, they've either inherited money, they're business owners, they're making good salaries for the first time. And a lot of them are younger. So I see a lot of, I don't see really sort of like the dire situations. I see, eagerness to do the right thing and plan for the future and save, but they don't necessarily know how. I think the information has been sort of obscured. You sign up for a 401k, you maybe automatically get it increased every year. You save,
the company contributes.
Maybe you save 10%. Maybe the company saves 3 to 5, depending on what but what does that mean? And what are you invested in? And what's it going to look like at the end? When you go to retire, what's that bucket of money going to be? And how are you going to translate that into a paycheck, to replace? So I think that's been the challenge. And what I see are people coming to me and they've got some really good ideas around, my brother-in-law told me to invest in this stock. Or Pablo, we've had this conversation. Or, somebody told me to invest in this particular apartment building or, this particular piece of real estate. And so as a planner, I'm always like, okay, let's look at the big picture and let's really look at, what your cash flow is, what you're going to need down the road, and then figure out ways that we can replace that. And when it comes to saving for retirement and replacing your income, I think the 401ks are great places to start, workplace investors, because
you're doing something.
You're doing something and you don't have a lot of money to start, right?
Right.
But then
it's invisible money because it's coming out of your paycheck before you get it and have to decide what to do with it.
Yeah, and there are tax benefits. And,
right.
Yeah, and it's automatic.
Right.
But then you really need to start thinking about what that is and be sort of deliberate about that. Right. And then I've got other people coming to me and they're like, oh, I want to do this particular real estate thing. Okay. Do we have enough cash reserves? So I think it's education. One, I think, there are a number of people. So I'm a Gen Xer, solid Gen Xer, and younger who know that they need to save. They're independent minded and they don't even mind that responsibility is theirs, but they don't know how and what to invest in. So I think that's where I start to see, people need to really understand diversification.
Right.
What's a stock market investment versus what's a real estate investment? What are my risks?
What's safe?
And access. How much cash do I need?
Right.
How much can I survive in a downturn?
What's
more stable? Right. Exactly.
Or a road or
and then what's going to be stable. So that's a
little
bit of a rabbit hole there, Pablo. But
no, I like it. You know what I find really interesting is that we both kind of self-describe as 3 different generations. And as I think of how all this hits, right? Well, first of all, a great point by couple of folks here in the chat, right? Like Paige Santorios and Reggie Fonse talking about how agreeing with you all, right? Like this financial education piece, the idea that if we could teach this stuff in high school, then people would enter the workforce as
you're not too
ahead,
early,
right? Like if I
start learning.
Yeah. As I think of it across the generations, I'm thinking about when I first started working and working for a Fortune 500 company, right? Like 50% 401k match up to like 50, up to the 10% contribution. They would give me 50% 401k match. So was totally maxing that stuff out. Didn't really know what I was doing in it, right? Like there wasn't a lot of education on compounding and even more importantly, education on what happens if you delay this, right? Like, I feel like you get told a lot of this, like, oh yeah, if you just do this dollar cost average, blah, 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 blah. I think some education around the idea of, well, if you don't do this now, and then you start doing it at this point, then this
Right.
is what you need to figure out. Like, are you going to make these huge bonuses? How are you going to create like this stuff to like put in? I think would have been really helpful. But I think for me, the hardest thing, well, before we go there, Lee, as the elder statesman of this group of three here, when you entered the workforce, was it a 401k thing? Can you tell me about kind of like your intro into workforce and investing, and before you got to the point where you started using your 401k money to invest in real estate, kind of how did you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, in all of my jobs, ADP, Provident Bank, and then Medical Mutual were my three jobs over the last 50 years. And each one of those had a retirement account, 401k, that they would participate in. And it was always a percentage of what I did. And they said, oh, you can put a max of 6%. And then it became, oh, you can put a max of 7%. And then the longer you work there, the more you can put in and everything. But it's like my wife said, right? You're taught to save, 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 and then in retirement, you can, spend, spend, spend. Well, the highlight of that is you're starting to chip away from that nest egg that you built.
Yeah.
And then, everybody's living longer than what they're supposed to.
And inflation.
And inflation. And I mean, all of that, like the value of the dollar is not worth the same. So when you pull the trigger and say, I'm retiring, that's it. You're not contributing to it anymore. And then it just starts eroding.
Yeah.
And that's what got me, I went to Fortune Builders, and Fortune Builders talked about how do you protect your investments? And it was the passive income club. And, once Jane and I went to listen to somebody say, hey, an older guy went and he was worried about his $250,000 wasn't going to take him for the rest of his life. He could invest it in a house that was going to generate positive cash flow. And then how can he leverage that to get another house and get another house and get to the cash flow that he needs to get to a point where he can retire and not worry about his nest egg dwindling. And we heard that. Jane was like, that's genius. That's not what we were taught growing up.
But think about how much collective knowledge it took.
Oh yeah.
To come together for him to be at that point where he was with that group of people who could teach him that.
Right.
And for that group of people who learned through their shared experiences how to sort of boil it down and give it, and that's one solution.
Right.
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 So I think the ecosystem is just really, really complicated, in terms of what to invest, like what to do. We've got a bunch of people I'll give everybody the benefit of the doubt, a lot of people are working hard and trying to save, but what do they do with it?
I mean, my dad is 85 and he was, proud to tell me, oh, I just took all my money out of the stock market and put it in bonds. And I'm going, what? What are you doing?
Well, consistent income, but probably not going to beat inflation if you're going to live, another 30 years or so.
Yeah, right. No, he's got one foot in the banana peel.
A lot of good points, Lee. I think that idea of, you were doing the points that really
you
stand out
thought you
to
were
me.
doing it right, but that was the training at the time,
The wisdom
right?
of the day. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it took us to get involved with people who had the knowledge and the real estate, insight, and we paid, right? So it was like one of those things where you say, you either learn from doing or you learn by paying.
Yeah.
Right. And we wanted to do the shortcut and learn by paying. So we paid,
man,
but it was beneficial.
Yeah, to that point, right? Like these real estate education programs, I remember when I first started thinking about that, maybe 10 years ago, it was like a $25,000 investment for me, or at least that's what was being offered for me, right? So like that's a pretty pricey entry point of like understanding that stuff. But it sounded like you were kind of like keyed into the fallacy of saving this much to then live off of this much as it goes down. For me, probably the most harmful thing that I think happened to me in my wealth building journey is the fact that as an old millennial, I went into the workforce and was committed to my 401k just blindly, right? Like I just knew I had to do it. And then and I was in construction, and then 2008 happened. And I remember there was a sports show analyst called Colin Cowherd. He's like, everybody's 401k just turned into a 201k. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly what just happened to me.
Yeah.
So, at that point I took my first entrepreneurial like leap, did okay. ended up joining a company that again had a 401k plan, but had lost all this faith in it, right? Like, so I wasn't maxing it out. I wasn't doing those things. And I feel like I lost some valuable time there as far as building while I was younger because of a bad experience with the volatility of the market.
And if you
And
stayed invested, it would have come roaring back.
it would have
But did
come
you know,
roaring back.
you know
Yeah.
to do that? Yeah.
100%. I
Yeah,
took
you're
the
shell
super safe
shocked.
path. I took
Yeah.
what your dad did. I was like, no, I'm going to put all this stuff in bonds because I don't
Yeah.
want to lose this stuff again. Whereas it would have come completely roaring back. I just didn't have that education either. So I don't know. Kelly, do you see that as you are, when you see clients coming on, you said you deal with a lot of like younger ones. I wonder if you see kind of like different, I guess, wounds is the way that I would call it, that give people these fallacies that they're then not making the right actions. Or do you see patterns in that?
Yeah, well, the younger clients don't have the wounds that we do living through like
Sure.
2008, you know, or
Yeah.
seeing some of our parents and grandparents live out their lives with perhaps financial mistakes. So it hasn't been that terrible, but I do see clients come in with certain perceptions in mind. You know, I've got this money now and, you know, my colleagues say I should be investing in crypto. I've got this money now and should I, you know,
What's the next
in
best
addition to
thing,
my
right?
401k, should I be investing in real estate? Maybe, you know, so I'm always looking at it from a systemic approach. Like if you know, depending on the dollars that you have to invest in, really your understanding of how the market works and various investments. And that's what I'm here to help educate you on. So then when we get into like larger dollar values, you know, larger portfolios, take 5 to 10% of it, and you can carve it off into what we would call alternative investments. And that, you know, real estate is one form of that. And there are lots of flavors of real estate too. So taking that path, then we look at, all right, if you have the aptitude for that and the risk tolerance for that, because it's a fairly high cost of entry, you know, a JWB house is 70, 80 grand is a down payment now.
Yep.
Right. So that, again, if that's a small percentage of your portfolio, it may make a whole lot of sense. You know, it's a lot easier to say, okay, now we need cash reserves and what can you expect in return? How does that translate to your overall portfolio? And maybe it's a very straightforward sort of conversation. But if you've only got, you know, $500,000, now that's a big chunk. Now we need to sort of think about it in terms of, when are you going to need the money? You know, we're always talking about time horizons. You know, are we talking about 10? Can you afford to keep this in real estate for 10 years or more, a full market cycle? Often long-term investments, you want them in the stock market for 10 years or more as well. But then we are really talking about conservative things for short-term, like cash, high yield savings accounts, bond funds, things like that, if you need that cash in the next 3 to 5 years. So taking kind of a big step back, I think everybody comes in with a perception of what they should be investing in, and they have, you know, their current situation. And I'm always trying to say, okay, let's look at the whole picture. Let's look what you need in the short term. Let's look at what you need in the long term. Then we start to talk about how we layer on the investments that make sense for you.